So good afternoon, good evening. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Ilona Kickbusch. I'm the director of the Global Health Center here at the Graduate Institute. I'm also a member of the Independent Commission on NCDs that was established by the Director General a couple of months ago. And I've been involved in the kind of NCD type discussions nearly all my life. We used to call it health promotion. We thought that was more appropriate than a disease-based title. And it's really interesting to see that in the 13th General Program of Work of the WHO now, the very first two words are promote health. So maybe that will also lead to a bit of a change. In the context of the work of this commission, and there's been a lot of debate about the text and everything that I can't go into at this point in time, but one of the phrases that was chosen was a new economic paradigm for NCDs. And that's why we put it in the title here. We'll discuss that afterwards. One of the reasons for this phrase is, and many of you know this, that I frequently use the phrase commercial determinants of health, and I still find that a really good phrase. But that was not accepted by all the members of the commission. They didn't feel. Can I ask you to come forward, please? We want to have a real conversation. So it came to this, and some of the things, though, that we do want to discuss under the heading commercial determinants of health, or that people like myself have done, are in the report and are at least indicated. But what we thought we'd do this evening, because for some of you it's sort of towards the end of the assembly and you've had, as I said, as many panel discussions as you can bear, is that we would have a discussion. I will ask one or two questions, but then we started getting to know each other out there, and straight away these two wonderful people started debating away. So that's why I decided not to sit in the middle, but to be a moderator on the side, so that also they can really discuss with each other in terms of concepts, approaches, and policies. You've seen who these two wonderful speakers are. Rachel Melsom, who's the Director UK and Europe from Tobacco-Free Portfolios, one of my favorite policy approaches right now that I tweet about all the time. And you have a detailed biography here. And Nick Banatvala, who's the Senior Advisor at the Secretariat of the UN Interagency Task Force on the Prevention and Control of NCDs at the WHO, and he will tell us what that title implies and what his job is in more detail, which is exactly about some of the financing issues that we're going to discuss. You know that we have discussed in a variety of ways around these commercial determinants of health that actually we need to have a different understanding of the macroeconomics of the NCDs, that it's not just an issue about the individual products and companies, but that consumer products are part of a major capital flow in our globalized world, that they are serious investments, that a lot of money is made, and through these investments, and that therefore there's also significant political pressure, not only from individual companies who do not want to lose their business, but also from capital markets and from equity investors. So those are some of the things we'll also be exploring. But I'd like to ask Rachel to start with something that perhaps best illustrates what we want to discuss with you. She'll ask you a question or two. So Rachel, take one of the mics. It's just easier for people to understand.
Everybody hear this? Great. I'm actually going to ask you all to stand up, please. In fact, we need to do this too. Now, if you don't have a pension, you can sit down.
Okay, do you have a pension?
Do you have a pension fund? If yes, remain standing.
Okay.
If you have ever asked anybody that runs your pension fund what your money is invested in, remain standing. This could be very quick, Ilona.
At the UN pension scheme, we've asked people about this.
No, hold on.
No, he's staring at me because he's already onto me. We're only 5 minutes in.
Okay, lovely people who are still standing. You have asked somebody who runs your pension fund what's in it. If you've asked them whether or not it contains tobacco, please stay standing. One person left. Did you? Oh, are you sitting, or are you? Did you ask them whether your pension fund had tobacco in it?
Yeah, I can see what's in my pension fund, and I can see what's invested.
And does it contain tobacco?
I had choices about whether to invest in those or not.
And does it contain tobacco?
The ones that I have don't.
Don't. Brilliant. We have one person in the entire room who has selected for their pension fund not to contain tobacco and is knowledgeable about that. In fact, I could have sat down. I just thought it was more polite to remain standing. But I think that sort of illustrates the point that Ilona's trying to also highlight, that we are, as individuals, we have investments, we make choices, and we have choices that are made on our behalf. And actually, if we don't ask the questions of those who are acting on our behalf of what they're doing for us, then we remain part of the problem that we're trying to solve. And I think that's a really good illustration, because I would imagine that most people sitting here would prefer that their pension wasn't invested in tobacco.
So Nick, we just discussed you had that experience. You asked the question. What answer did you get? We'll just take that mic. It's easier.
Well, first of all, on the pension, I have asked the question, so I can remain standing. Do I know what the answer is? No, not really. So I'm not sure that you asked to sit down. If we'd asked but didn't have a clever idea. But
the answer.
I have also asked for, when it's come to investing outside in terms of ISAs, whether or not my products have either arms or tobacco. And my independent financial advisor, and I was saying to you outside, said it's really quite complicated. So I just gave up and thought, well, I'd done my bit by asking, but didn't really know what the answer was. And you told me it's not so complicated.
It's not complicated. And in fairness, I think that when a number of people ask about what's in their pension, the answer is, oh, it's very complicated, because there's a bit of a smoke and mirrors element going on occasion. A lot of times people, independent financial advisors are very good, and they will find the right products for you. But you do actually need to persevere. You need to state what you want. Rather than saying, what can I have, you need to state what you want, because it's your money, you're investing it, it's your future income, and you can determine what that is invested in. And I agree, Nick, when your financial advisor said it's complicated, it's not a quick fix. It's not something that when your monies are invested that somebody can say actually overnight, right, you don't want that, so we'll put it all over here. It takes time, and it takes transition, it takes work for your financial advisor to do it, and actually leaving your monies where they are is simpler for them. Changing it is more work, but it is eminently possible.
Any financial advisors in this room?
And it's difficult because a lot of us have corporate pensions, or I'm actually work within the NHS in the UK, so we contribute to a pension, but it's not actually invested in anything. It's government, it goes into the government, and they, on a wing and a prayer, are going to pay us something eventually when we're all old. However, even if you have a corporate pension, your fund will be a defined contribution fund or a defined benefit. Either way, there will be a set of investments that are made on your behalf, and you have every right to question what those investments are. And if you don't like what they are, you have every right to say that you want your monies moved.
So you know what you're going to do tomorrow morning, at the very latest on Monday. So Rachel, tell us about your organization. Tell us how this thinking actually came about, to say, well, let's not just talk about individual companies, let's not just talk about products, let's talk about the money flow. How did all this happen?
The very first incident that happened that created was the beginning of tobacco-free portfolios was our founder, who's a radiation oncologist, Dr. Bronwyn King, discovered that her pension, and she discovered this inadvertently over a coffee with her financial advisor, she discovered her pension was invested in tobacco. So the majority of her patients had lung cancer, and she discovered that she was contributing to that cause. So she went to the head of her hospital, because it's a superannuation fund in Australia, and said, do you realise our pension fund for all the healthcare workers is invested in tobacco? He very kindly introduced her to the head of the fund, and over an 18-month period, so to this point it's not a quick fix, they decided that it was eminently reasonable to actually take tobacco out of that fund. And it was such a reasonable conversation that they had with Bronwyn that they introduced her to the CEOs of a number of other funds. And that's literally how this work started. One person, one fund, actually realising that it wasn't just her, it was everybody. And that is the case, that tobacco is in pretty much every single pension fund in the world, bar the ones that we have either spoken to or that were already ethical funds and have moved out of tobacco. And it's a legacy product. It's been around for such a long time that it simply sits in every fund. It's only now, as individuals and corporations and entities are reviewing what appropriate, sustainable investment is, that they're beginning to say, this is not where we want to put our money. I'm sorry, you have a question.
Well, just a question, because that is becoming interested. I assume you know that the UN pension funds, can you reassure me that they are not investing in tobacco?
My understanding is it's not invested in tobacco, but Nick, you're going to be better at answering that question than I am.
There's been quite a lot of discussion on this, and you know, I'm ashamed to say that I'm not 100% sure that despite all those conversations, I know the answer. But Heike, you may know the answer to that. Dudley, do you know? Have you asked?
I'm about to Google that.
Oh, good, okay. You'll Google and let us know. But it kind of goes round and round all the time.
It does.
And then you start losing the plot of it because people kick up a fuss, and is it or is it not? And then you move on to something else. That's like your 18-month issue coming again.
It is
quite persistent.
It is, but what you have to do is keep at it. But
Yes.
the thing is, most people think the problem is solved. I speak to a large number of people, they say, surely nobody invests in tobacco anymore. And they're really surprised when I say, no, pretty much everybody does. And then they go away, and then they ask, and then they get the question answered, and then they're shocked, and then they do something about it. But it takes time. It really does, and it takes building awareness. So right now, we've got to the point where 70% of the corporate pension funds in Australia, which is about $1 trillion Aussie dollars of assets under management, are now tobacco-free. Now, that's over a 5-6 year period. It wasn't a quick fix, but Bronwyn's latest conversation with a board of a big pension fund was, how are we going to explain what took us so long? 5 years ago, that conversation was, why on earth would we want to move out of tobacco? It's so lucrative, it gives us such good income. How are we going to explain not getting that income? So in the grand scheme of things, 5 years is not very long. But over time, you know, it's a fair period to be addressing a problem.
So, Heike, you're very familiar with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Obviously, Heike ran the Secretariat for quite some time. In that context of the Framework Convention, your Secretariat, etc., did you discuss these kind of issues? Did they come up? To what extent, if they did?
You know, in the FCTC itself, thank you very much, Ilona. In the FCTC itself, there are some paragraphs and points where you can kind of follow this logic that the no incentives for tobacco industry, etc., etc. But there is nothing really very directly about the pension funds or any other funds, etc. That's why that's a very interesting topic. That's why also I came when I heard about this. I would like to ask you the question, is it about your focus, is it about the pension funds or investment in general? Other funds,
investment
other
in general. It started with pension funds,
Okay.
and then it sort of grew.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting topic, because I have to admit that in tobacco control circles, in the people who usually work on tobacco control, this is not a prominent issue. Mm. Everybody knows that this is, something should not be done, but not many people will know the real situation. Not many people will know, the good examples or kind of examples like you made. So that I think this deserves a large discussion and a kind of better awareness. Even in tobacco control community. I'm not even saying about the larger communities, but even in tobacco community, that's very important thing to say.
Can I ask you, Nick, you've been with the NCD and tobacco program for quite some time. How much has this been part of the discussions in the WHO?
There's been a little bit of discussion in terms, as I said, of going around the circles in terms of the UN pension fund. Apart from that, no, not at all. It's not
Why do you think that is?
Because there are just 4 risk factors, aren't there, for NCDs? That's all it's about. No, being serious for a moment, I guess that, you know, well, I suppose that as a public health agency, we probably have focused on those population-based approaches. We tend to come as a group of it as, you know, doctors, public health people, rather than thinking on these broader issues. So how many doctors had treated people with lung cancer, had never thought of it? Hundreds and thousands over the years. And finally, one person picked up this issue. So I think it does require someone who mind twigs, and I guess that just hasn't happened. So now this is an interesting issue, but you are kind of starting to get your voice recognised, but it probably isn't, I mean, people are not very aware of it, so I guess we just haven't thought about it. Sometimes you have to say, we hadn't really considered it. I don't think there's a reason why.
Yeah, I have 2 people here who want to speak. Please, Sarah.
Thanks, Ilona.
Just
Nick,
introduce yourself for
sure,
other people,
I'm
please.
Dudley Tarleton from the UN Development Program, and I'm glad Nick said exactly the right answer, because they're doctors, they're a health sector, it's WHO. Of course they're not thinking about investments and financial mechanisms, these things. There are other parts of the UN that are trying to look at these things. We're super late to the game, as we've been late to everything before. But we are thinking about the way that financial mechanisms impact public well-being and privatized profit, and we are working at it. Rachel and I had a conversation today about a social impact bond that we're designing to help tobacco growers switch to other livelihoods. Well, you know, in the Article 17 and 18 sphere of the FCC. So we're late to it, but it is happening, and I did find that at least the UN Pension Fund does not invest in tobacco or armaments and has some low climate specialization as well. So at least we're okay on that.
Will you pass it to your neighbor?
Hi, everyone. So, Jason Shelby from the Novartis Foundation. So I'm just curious, Rachel, I've heard of, for example, people addressing universities that have large investment funds, but more around the kind of fossil fuel industry. I'm just curious, are you pairing up with people who are working on that issue as well? Is that kind of a combined effort that potentially can have an impact?
In fairness, we're not pairing up with them, and there's a very clear reason for that. The issue with fossil fuels is less binary as it is with tobacco. With tobacco, it is very black and white. There is no good thing about tobacco, whereas with fossil fuels, transitioning to alternative energy forms is a requirement. We will continue to need energy, and working out how the investment community continues to invest in companies that enable that transition rather than just walk away from them is a very different method of approaching investment than the tobacco issue. And there's also a difference in approach, and there is room for every approach. I need to be clear on that. But the way we work is very discreetly behind the scenes in a very quiet way with senior executives in those entities. We don't have a name and shame website. We don't shout about who's still invested in tobacco. All we do is celebrate those who aren't, and have those conversations in a very reasonable fashion, which I think is why we've been so successful. What we focused on is translating what we in the health sector know into finance speak, so that it's actually relevant to them, so that they understand that you know, the impact of tobacco from a financial perspective, because ultimately, in the same way we're doctors or health professionals and we understand health issues, they get money. And actually telling them, dare I say it, that 7 million people a year are dying, unless that is put into context, that's fairly irrelevant because it's just another number amongst a sea of numbers that they're dealing with on a daily basis.
But Rachel, could I challenge you on that quite consciously? Because if we look at our new way of looking at NCDs, not just the economic paradigm, but our new way of looking at NCDs, it includes air pollution. And all the latest figures from WHO say, I don't know, what was it, 7 million people a year die. We're not even talking of those that... Yeah. So, you know, so it's probably, you know, 10 million people or more every year who die, and that's heavily related to fossil fuel. We have people who speak about, you know, we need to talk about planetary health, not just the health of people, but also the health of the planet. So in my view, actually, point one, it would make, at this point in time, I agree with you, about 5 years ago, probably not. But at this point in time, to actually combine the agendas with a health umbrella on top of it, you do both, and, you know, you're going to save more people than I don't know what, and maybe we have to start calculating that, what that could be. But also I think it's quite interesting, and maybe you have a comment or two on that, that a number of companies who actually started disinvesting from fossil fuel, then as a next step also divested from tobacco. So I thought that was very, very interesting. So I wonder if you have some thoughts on that to share with us.
That's a lot of questions in one go. Yes, I do.
I always do that.
I think the single best thing that's happened to any of these issues around investment is the Sustainable Development Goals, because it has enabled the finance sector to review all the impacts of the investments across the board and to actually see them, dare I say it, in small coloured squares in a way that they can say, actually, here's the poverty bit, here's the food bit, here's the pollution bit, here's the water bit. And actually, you know, they might think initially that tobacco is only about health. But when we point out to them that 14 of the 17 goals are negatively impacted by tobacco, it really resonates. And so I think pulling the other areas into this whole debate, for instance, fossil fuels, sugar. Sugar is a big question. I get asked about sugar the whole time. Again, it comes back to saying, from an investor's perspective, how can you review this? With tobacco, engagement with the tobacco companies isn't possible. We are, you know, if we were to engage, we'd be engaging with them to say, please cease your primary business. That's not a conversation that is going to go very far. However, if you engage with a fossil fuel company to say, we want to continue to invest, but only if you're looking at alternative methods of energy generation and reducing pollution and so on and so forth, then you start to have a conversation with them. And that's why it's not that the two aren't equally relevant, some potentially more relevant than others, but the approach is different. So in order to enable the wheels to start turning for those who have traditionally said, we invest in everything across the board with no exclusions, because that is the way that we want to manage investment. This is the first step in a very binary way of saying, there is nothing good about this product. Therefore, the decision is relatively easy in comparison to a fossil fuel decision.
Thank you. One more question, then I want to move on to Nick. Are you able to name some of the positive companies?
Yes, there have been some great announcements in the last 12 months alone, or even the last 6 months. BNP Paribas, which is one of the largest global banks, 7th largest in the world, has announced that it's no longer offering credit. So to the earlier point about where along the line what are we talking about, they're not offering credit to tobacco companies, and they're also their asset management arm, which is separate. They're not investing in tobacco companies. Similarly, ING, another bank based in Holland, has announced in April. NNIP and NN, which is a big asset management company and insurer in Holland, announced 4 days ago. ABP, which is the 5th largest pension fund in the world, announced in January that they're no longer investing in tobacco. All of these companies have said that is, and they've been through the system of internal reconciliation and building a framework to say, actually, how do we review this alongside all the other problematic products in a way that makes sense? Because from an investor's perspective, what they don't want to do is have everybody knocking on their door saying, but I don't like this and I don't like that and I don't like the other. They need a framework to be able to say there's a sensible review method. There are reams more, but I won't bore you. So one more, Aegon, enormous insurer.
Yeah, and Norwegian Sovereign Wealth
Norwegian
Fund.
Sovereign Wealth Fund has been tobacco free for a long time.
Yeah. So Nick, let's move on to you. I've stolen that title, as I said, from the NCD Commission. When we were talking outside, you said, well, I'm not so sure there's a new economic paradigm for health out there. Why do you say that?
Well, I didn't say that there wasn't a new economic paradigm out there. What I was saying was that I get concerned when we start talking about new economic paradigms for things, because it provides the opportunity to be looking for some holy grail, for some magic bullet that's out there. And of course, yes, there are lots of exciting, innovative approaches that one can think of. But there are also quite a lot of tried and trusted mechanisms that exist, which we can and should be utilizing. And it provides everyone a sort of an opportunity or a way out of taking action and responsibility, because we're searching for the new paradigm. I realize that, of course, you've got to use words like new paradigm if you're going to have an attractive report, but when it comes to action on the ground, you know, it's the same old thing, isn't it? You've got to do what they said in Addis Ababa a while ago. You've got to get more domestic resources in. You've got to look at the different approaches. You've got to start getting people having health coverage. You've got to get universal health coverage. You've got to get systems in place and financing systems in the country. You've got to get a bit of official development assistance in, maybe not to the same degree as required, but to catalyze the response. You can think about some of your little, your innovative financing mechanisms, some of your trust funds, some of your other things, yeah. But none of that is really new. It's about actually doing it, because if you look at the amount of money that's going into this area, it's pitifully small. Some people say it's 0.2% of ODA. We're talking about ODA at the moment, but some people say it's 2%. We don't know, because we don't actually have a marker for that. That's being developed at the moment, and there will be an OECD DAG indicator that will tell us in 2019 what we're spending. But when you think about the burden, it's pretty small. Now, it's not that you need to say, therefore we need to raise it right up to, but you've got to have some level of development assistance. Okay, if you want to say your new paradigm shift is to say, well, let's look at new interesting donors from, Brazil and India and China, fine. If you want to say, let's look at the Middle East as well and look at some of those, that's fine. If you want to say, let's think about the private sector and how the private sector in terms of moving in, fine. If you want to talk about social impact bonds, yeah. But social impact bonds have been around for quite a while. It's not a new paradigm. So none of this to me is overly new. It's about getting on and doing it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that was part of the issue even when the Commission started its work. Because, of course, whatever you call it, the best buys or the Framework Convention or whatever are out there to be implemented. And, of course, then the question is, what are the barriers that it hasn't been implemented? And, of course, the majority of the barriers are political barriers, straightforward, and political barriers that are then linked to the enormous money flows that are related to these issues. No matter how you call them. I would still say, no matter what you call it, that the tremendous money flows have not been looked at enough, particularly because they cannot be addressed just through national policies, even though, a fair bit of stuff could be done if you just implemented the Framework Convention. But that, these transnational money flows, of course, develop an enormous strength and power. And individual smaller countries, even if they wanted to legislate and implement, are in a very difficult position. But still, sticking to that, because you've mentioned these various instruments that already exist. You've been working on investment cases. If one were to go, I guess, to a finance minister to say, look, this is what you need to do, I guess it also implies raising taxes or putting taxes on certain issues. Can you share with us some of the things that you are thinking about in terms of raising money in order to do these policies and this implementation?
Sure. Before that, I think we would just need to take a step back, because I think we're only now just beginning to articulate why countries should invest in non-communicable diseases and mental health. I think we've really done that effectively up till now. Now, some of you may have been at the launch of that WHO Saving Lives, Costing Less launch that was held on Sunday evening, which was WHO work funded by Bloomberg, which looked at the global case for investing in NCDs. And some of you will be aware that together, WHO and the UN Development Programme and the World Bank as well have been doing these sorts of cases for investing in countries, working with ministries of health and working with ministries of finance to see what the returns are, but also what are the costs of inaction at the country level. So you've got your global figures now, and then you've got these country-specific figures.
Can I just ask a historical question, though? You said, some of this is relatively new. If I sort of remember dimly, didn't the World Bank start quite soon supporting tobacco investments? And why did they do that?
Well,
with an economic argument or a health argument?
Well, I think that's right, but I don't think we've been taking these arguments out to the countries and actually going to a place like Kyrgyzstan or Mongolia or Kenya and saying, all right, first of all, do you understand what the impact of this is? What's the impact on your GDP? What's the impact on your labour force? How many people are dropping down dead before they're still at work? How many people are turning up to work but not being as productive? How many people are not turning up to work and are absent from work because of these diseases? And people haven't really kind of looked at that. Once they look at that, then you see this tip of the iceberg where you see, some money that the health system are losing as a result of this or having to pour in. But underneath, you see a much bigger amount that's being lost. So I think the first thing is making people aware. And then ministries of finance and ministries of labour will start saying, gosh, we need to start thinking how we deal with this. And there are only two ways of dealing with it. One is that you pull more money in. And of course, in many countries, that's definitely needed. We need much better primary care, much better coverage for these diseases. People need to be able to be managed. You can't, resolve the situation without that. So let's not kid ourselves. But you also need to be investing in the policy. You need to be making sure that you're starting to get political buy-in and people realise that actually, if you increase tax on tobacco products or on alcohol, it has a big impact, a substantial impact. So the two need to go together. And my argument would be that that sort of work at that policy level requires relatively small amounts of financing. It requires catalytic funding. It requires technical assistance. So after you make the case to the Ministry of Health, to the Ministry of Finance, or you go and you talk with ministries of trade, they're all up for exploring this, not necessarily acting on it, but exploring it. But then they need a bit of assistance to know how to do that. Because we know in even the most sophisticated of countries, there's a lot of work that needs to go into legislation, regulation, enforcement. You've got to engage with parliamentarians. You've got to engage with ministers. They've got to understand what the different dynamics are, how they're going to be influenced by the private sector. So there's quite a lot of work that's required, and that's not about huge amounts of money, but it's about smart money.
Yeah, I'm reminded of something, and then I'll ask you a question once I've told the story. When I was working with WHO in the European office, one of the programs in my directorate was the tobacco program. And as many of you know, in 1989, Europe changed. The Eastern European countries restructured themselves and were introducing new laws, new regulations, new political systems. And in that period, in the regional office, there were all these emergency meetings. What do these countries need now? What are urgent measures we need to take, et cetera, et cetera. And so I come into these meetings and everyone's talking about really serious diseases and health systems breaking down and I don't know what not. And I say, I think we should work on the tobacco legislation in the country. They all looked at me as if, I'd that's not an emergency. And so I said, of course it's an emergency. I said, these countries are formulating all their laws. They are formulating, for example, their communication laws. Should public radio be allowed to advertise tobacco? Very simply. So everything that, they're reconstructing in the society is changing right now and will either support selling cigarettes or make it more difficult. It took a while, and I had a fantastic person working with me who was responsible for tobacco, Tapani Piha, who maybe some of you know. And so we got active. So finally it got on the emergency list. You won't believe this. But then, of course, the question was the money. In the end, the nearly perverse situation emerged that Canada paid for the tobacco work that was being done in the European office to support Eastern Europe. But, and those of you that are in tobacco will probably know this, the country where we were most successful in doing this, also because there was a very strong professional community, a very strong medical community, was Poland. And if you compare the smoking figures in Poland to many other Eastern European countries, you see quite a significant difference. So actually sometimes I'm thinking one should go back and write that story and then show over the long term maybe how many lives that has saved, because one was able to get on a list that normally only has, AIDS and maternity hospitals are closing and I don't know what not. But nobody was really willing to move into that. And I must say I was lucky to have somebody such as Tapani Piha, who had been involved in Finnish tobacco legislation, who had that knowledge. We were able to pull other people with such knowledge in and spent a heck of a lot of time in Poland and other countries. So that's my question to you, Nick, in terms of if this needs to be done. Does WHO have the people to do it? I don't mean now in numbers, but with that type of expertise, does it have enough people who understand regulation, who understand media law, who understand advertising law, who understand a heck of a lot of things that you then need to take into account, and what would it take to have them? Or who should one work with to have them?
Well, I guess that health, public health, has moved on so much since WHO was founded, and the challenges are really very different, that no one would have thought that we would be facing the situation of non-communicable diseases several years ago. It certainly wasn't on the priority. And indeed, it's only been in the last few years that you start seeing at the World Health Assembly significant attention being paid for this. So clearly, yes, there are some skills in-house, absolutely. But are they adequate, both in depth and in breadth, in number? No, they're not. But WHO is part of a wider system. It's part of the UN system. It's also got lots of other partners around. WHO, if it is one thing, is an effective convening organization. So it should be making sure that where it doesn't have the skills, it doesn't say, we've got to have the skills in every place. We should be reaching out to others. So this brings us a little bit to the work that I'm involved in, where I lead the secretariat for this UN task force. And this brings together a number of different UN agencies, where we then start saying, well, if there's a problem or an issue around tobacco taxation, or let's say around legislation or around risk communication, then there are many people that can come to the party with skills. It may be UNICEF with their skills, it may be UNFPA, it may be UNDP, but it may well be ILO or FAO. So a number of these people are in country, and the trick is to try and get them to come to the table to do just what you're indicating, to recognize that the Sustainable Development Agenda provides that opportunity, because they can see that there are, was it 14 you said, areas?
14 to 17.
17 areas. The guys working on harmful use of alcohol will have a similar number. So we should be joining up our efforts. And that's where the challenge is.
Can I just say, I completely endorse that. And
But?
PSI and UNEP, FI and PRI all joined together when we
Not
launched...
everybody knows all this. Can you just say
Oh,
who
they
these
are?
organizations
Sorry.
are? Yeah.
United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, the United Nations Principles for Sustainable Insurance, UNEP FI, the Finance, United Nations, help me out here, I lose track of the acronyms, United Nations Environment, UNEP, what's the P?
Program.
Program, Financial Initiative, sorry, kind of have to track them along. And the WHO, we know what the WHO is, FCTC, Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Those elements came together last year on World No Tobacco Day to endorse the statement, the first investor statement on tobacco, which was to uphold government activity on implementing the FCTC. So it was UN coming together with investors and working together, and that was a real pulling together. So all I was going to say is I endorse what you're saying.
Two questions following from this. First of all, in the recommendations from the commission that will come out, there is a suggestion that WHO, together with others in one way or the other, should actually create an investors forum to discuss these kind of issues. Do you think that's a good idea?
I guess it depends what the goal is of the forum. Just discussing the issues, I think airing them and getting them more well known is very useful. Having a roadmap and actually doing something about it would be even more useful, and perhaps putting some items in place that say, actually, if we know this, then we can do this, rather than re-identifying the problem and rephrasing it with different terminology. Having said that, sometimes new terminology awakens everybody to a problem and enables them to act on it. So mixed feelings, but generally, yes, I think we should, but we have to be really clear about what we want to do.
I'll come back to you, Nick, with that question as well, but I wanted to pick up on the skills issue, because I was really intrigued. You say, you know, your founder was a cancer doctor, basically, and then she goes off into this investors world, and then she creates all this. And then you say, we work in a special way. We don't run out there and do loud advocacy. We actually go into the offices on the 20th floor or whatever, and we talk to people. So tell us a bit about how you do that. You know, we would call that health diplomacy, and what kind of skills are actually needed to do that kind of stuff.
I think where we've got to has been a combination of luck and skill, I have to be honest, because the first conversation that Bronwyn had was with the CEO, who felt it was such a reasonable conversation that he helped her, got her onto panels with the finance sector, and enabled her to adjust the language that she used so that it was relevant to the audience she was talking to. So it was a really steep learning curve and a very quick route through to having to learn what to say, how to say it, to know that certain words are absolute triggers for investors, and if you say them, they will, you know, almost just shut down.
Like?
Disinvestment or divestment is an absolute no-no. Exclusion policy, again, that is not something that an investor likes to hear, because it's an absolute, and they like to think about all the different options for all the right reasons. It's completely reasonable. So if you're actually going to head down that route, you have to have a really clear reason and a really good rationale and build up of all the different arguments. So what we do and how we do it was a steep learning curve, B, understanding what the language is that we need to talk in so that we're understood, so that all the health messaging we've got is still there. It's just made relevant. And you had another question, which was, how did Bronwyn get there? How did we do what we were doing?
Just the skills that you need,
and
basically.
And I think it is diplomacy. It is understanding and knowing that you're talking to other human beings. When you start to explain the issues, they're not monsters. They're not terrible people. They just haven't necessarily had all the facts put in front of them in a way that makes them think again about what they're investing in. And that's also, I think we manage to get the meetings we get because we're doctors. So we're not We're not saying you're terrible investors and we're better investors. We're not investors at all. We're doctors, but we can tell you about some of the things that investment is doing in a way that's useful. So.
Thank you. You had a question or a comment? The mic's just coming, just 1 minute. It's easier for people.
Hi, Desi Tarotan from Unitate. I had a question for Nick on the role of civil society in the investment cases that you do and how they should be used to put pressure on governments to move forward. And I like your sort of silent mobilization, but I think there's also space for something a bit more vocal to support the policies that you recommend. And is that part of the model that you're exploring?
Our main key stakeholders, use that awful term, have been people in government, essentially, with these. But your question goes back to first principles. Don't ever try and do something that you want to share with others if you don't engage them right at the onset. Because if you want people to buy in and to feel ownership, they've got to be part of it right at the beginning. So we probably don't do as much as one could in terms of engaging civil society right at the beginning when we were embarking upon this. Of course, one does once one has completed something, because you expect then civil society to go out and to promote what you're doing. So I think you're probably alluding to a very important point, which is actually you need to make sure that you've got a whole variety of partners, the sorts that we've been talking about right at the onset. I think we always face a challenge of wanting to move things fairly quickly, and taking a step back sometimes is helpful. You know, sometimes you, at a meeting like this, and you hear one or two things, you think, oh, I'm going to take that back and think about that. And that's an example where I think I would take that back and I would say, do we do enough when it comes to the planning and the start of the investment case process to get a whole range of actors involved? Or do we get those actors, including the media, on once we've done the process and we're ready to share it? So I think that's a reasonable point. I just want to come back to a couple of issues around the Sustainable Development Agenda, because everyone says it's the greatest thing in the world, and it is in many ways, and I dare not say otherwise. But there is a slight danger that it's so broad, it's so fantastic, that actually you don't drill down to something specific, because no, we don't deal with that. It's too specific. It's not high enough level for us. And when I was in Manila just 2 weeks ago, we were talking with the UN country team, and I was saying, how involved are you in this whole, I don't want to call it NCDs, this whole issue? And they were saying, well, you know, we've got this UNDAF, and we've got, it's not really there. And I said, what do you mean it's not there? If you're not actually working on this agenda, I've just been spending the last week in this urban jungle of Manila, and wow, this is just like the breeding ground of urbanization. You can't walk around, you can't cycle around, you go to work, and it's amazing. People do their exercises when they're actually in their working place, and there are edicts across government that people in the private sector will do that, and they do that. The Great Filipino Workout is what they call it, and they actually have edicts. And I said, does this thing exist? And they said, yeah. And when you went around, you actually saw people do this. And there we were in this situation where you've got all the issues associated with lack of exercise, tobacco, unhealthy diet. It's this fantastic breeding ground. As one of my colleagues says, it's going to be in cities where this game is going to be won or lost. And you think to yourself, UN agencies, this cuts across all your agenda. And the difficulty is that we're still quite siloed as agencies, and WHO is still the lead for this. And people say, well, how do I influence people in terms of getting UNDP or UNICEF involved in this at the country level? And it comes back to your point, which is there is no substitution for actually recognizing someone, a person, going to have a cup of coffee with them and chatting them and explaining it. And people will say, oh, I'm interested in that. But how difficult is that if you're in Nairobi or if you're in Manila and it takes an hour and a half to get into the car to get to have a meeting with someone? It then becomes practically very difficult to try and influence people. You go to some big meeting, but you don't have this opportunity. So what I'm just trying to say is, in the reality of the world that we've got, it's really hard, practically, to be doing the sort of stuff we need to do to join up our work.
Rachel, can I come back to this geopolitical issue in a way? You know, the companies that you speak to, the pension funds, etc., the banks, are they all in the West, or are you talking to banks, investment funds, whatever, in China, in Brazil, in...
Not so much in China. Some of the other, so Japan, Korea, yes. Brazil, not yet. I say not yet because the meetings haven't occurred yet, but there are 3 of us. And the world's a big place, so we're trying to cover as much as we can, and a lot of that is driven by the connections that we have, the introductions that are made, and the best way to reach those. So a lot of my work recently has been in Europe, and that has, again, in Holland, for instance, I'll meet one fund who introduces me to another, who introduces me to a bank, who introduces me to an asset manager, and suddenly I have 10 meetings there rather than the 2 that I was thinking of. And then one of them knows somebody in Sweden, and then my next trip is Sweden, and then there are another 4. And that's effectively how it develops. Canada is growing in the number of meetings we're having there. America is quite a hard market, and we've had a number of meetings, but we don't have anybody there. We don't have anybody in Canada. We hope very soon to have somebody in India, and that will, again, that will accelerate that program significantly. But yes and no, I guess, is the answer to that.
So I guess, you know, to do the kind of work you do, you need to be seen as truly independent.
Yes.
And I mean, you indicated one important dimension is that you are seen as medical people with a public health goal.
Yes.
And that you know, gives you a certain credibility. I think trust is an important thing.
Trust is absolutely at the centre.
And so just to say, you know, you sort of say, we're 3 people. How are you financed?
Entirely by donation, and I have to be honest, it's incredibly difficult. We are, we go from Cancer Research UK in the UK have very kindly been funding my position for the last 2 years. That is tapering currently, and I need to find additional finance to keep doing the work across Europe, and that's an open space right now. I'll be honest, that's not in the bag, so it's a difficult one. In Australia, a lot of the work has been done, and it's very interesting. A lot of the cancer organisations have funded us rather than the finance sector funding us, whereas it's the finance sector that is benefiting. So we're trying to work ways of doing that, and a bank has indeed recently given some money towards the European position on a pay-it-forward basis, which I particularly like in terms of the way they thought about it, as in we don't charge fees, we're not consultants as such, and the reason for that is if we did, we wouldn't get the meetings. So we are completely available for advice and meetings to whoever will have meetings with us or asks us for advice. They have benefited from that, made their decision, announced their decision, and because they found that such a good process, they have given us a sum of money on a pay-it-forward so the next person can benefit. So that's another way of looking at it, but it's entirely charitable donation. So there's no funding from any official bodies that comes to us currently.
Blomberg hasn't come to you?
No, we're ever hopeful.
Have you gone to Blomberg? What?
All conversations are always open.
Okay, all right. There's a question there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Laura Solia Shellaby I'm the City Health Financing Lead for the City Cancer Challenge, which is an initiative of the Union for International Cancer Control. And the work that we're doing in cities around the world on cancer is very, for lack of a better word, I'll say grassroots. We're working with the people in the cities who are actually providing healthcare, so very often it's hospital administrators, it's city-level health secretaries, regional health secretaries, and what is incredibly apparent through the work is that the people who are deciding what budget is available for health activities are not often the people who are part of these types of conversations that we're having in Geneva this week. The people who are actually thinking about how much funding is going towards X program may not even know the word, may not even know what NCDs are, let alone be part of these dialogues. And I'm very excited to hear that coming out of the Commission report, there's the potential for a forum with investors, because I think we see across the board that the skill sets and the language of financing, of the economics behind this are not often in the health conversations, but very often the health conversation isn't in the health dialogue isn't part of the decision-making process when it actually comes to what dollars are going where. So my question is what is being done to move beyond the usual suspects and the people who are, say, part of this dialogue or those that were in Copenhagen a few weeks ago, and what needs to be done, and how can we move that conversation beyond national level entities to that decision-making level, which usually tends to be a lot lower down when you're talking about actually driving access to healthcare?
Long question. Nick, do you have some answers?
Well, one of the things that the Commission was toying with, and I don't know where they are because we don't have a final report, but I think was in a draft report, was the idea of trying to pool some resources using new investors into some sort of catalytic fund or initiative. People are very good at now beginning to think about large-scale World Bank loans or programs or projects that are being done. We're starting to see funds that are going into treatment, but we're still not seeing the funds into some of these cross-cutting governance issues, catalyzing the financing at the country level, catalyzing the legislation and regulatory and enforcement issues, catalyzing effective engagement with the private sector, catalyzing action in terms of getting risk communication out. All these things are really important. And if you develop some sort of funding mechanism, which is what you were sort of thinking about there, where you can then start pooling small amounts of resources from different groups, you're sharing the burden. And we don't need to look at the old model where you're relying on the old development partners. We're now in a new model where you should be looking at different forms of private sector coming to the party, provided they're the right private sector, but also looking at other partners as well. I mentioned some of those earlier as well. So I think that if there is an area for innovation, if there is a new paradigm, it's around trying to get more and different partners to the table over this particular issue.
There, gentlemen.
Hi, my name is Sridhar. I'm a visiting researcher at the Center for Global Health. I'm from King's College London. Can I just make one statement and one question? So the one statement is that, so I love this panel. I think it's one of the most interesting ones because it could actually go off the rails in really interesting directions. So one of the things that I'm an academic, and I work with a number of social epidemiologists and political economists. And so from your title of your panel, I thought you were going to talk about macroeconomics and their relationship to NCDs. What I'm hearing a lot is about financing health programs for NCDs. I think those two things could go against each other, right? So many political economists that I work with and social epidemiologists have basically shown that capitalism is bad for health, right? Social and economic inequality is bad for health. We've shown that that is bad for infectious diseases in terms of why epidemics happen, is that there's lots of social and economic inequality. Now they've also shown that this is also true generally for health and also NCDs. So the reason why Bloomberg wouldn't support divestment into all of this stuff is because fundamentally there's this whole thing about how do you reconcile the current economic sort of system, the way it goes, and promoting good health at the same time, and there seems to be a disconnect here. So I think I'm interested in how the Commission handles that kind of macroeconomic sort of question about what kind of good economy is good or bad for health. The second thing that I have is this idea about clean hands. So I was put on a committee for my university about divestment. It started from student protests, and they wanted the university to divest from fossil fuels. And so we spent a whole year going through the whole thing. And what it turned out is that divestment for fossil fuels is the least of the bigger problems of the university, because it actually uses so much energy, and it actually produces so much waste. And actually, we care about divestment of fossil fuels because of the harm that it does to people. So we actually need to think about what are the different things that are harming people in what we do, right? So when you start doing that into your investment portfolio, there's nothing that keeps your hands clean, right? So in order to find a business that actually makes money and has their hands clean is nearly impossible, right? So there's this question about how, if you are going to be a model for other people, like where do you think the line is drawn about how do you keep your hands clean while making money as a business or as an investor or someone who's looking for security in their old age?
Thank you. So, Rachel, how do you argue?
To the final question, how do you keep your hands clean? I think it ultimately is going to depend on, because tied into, and how do you make money for a pension fund? It depends on what your definition of clean is. And I'm not being trite by saying that, but I think that there are a number of investments that will be made, for instance, in various types of fuel over the years, until we have a total 100% transition to clean energy. Hands will be dirty. The question is, are those hands dirty because they continue to invest in fossil fuels that aren't seeing any change, or are they dirty because they're invested in the companies that are affecting change? And that's why, I think we have to look at the trajectory that we're all wanting to travel along, rather than saying on day one, everything bad, quote unquote, has to go. Because, we will always find areas that there is a debate about, is sugar good or bad? I don't think sugar is binary. I think there's an amount of sugar that is probably useful to have in a diet, and there's an amount that's too much. And there's a responsibility for the too much end of the market that lies with certain producers that we then need to have a debate with and say, actually, if you continue to behave in this way and market to kids or whatever it might be, then we're going to withdraw our investment, because that has a negative effect on the company's valuation. So you're basically working back through the financial stream to say, please amend your behaviour. So again, does that mean that your hands are clean? Or have you just effected some change and you've made them less dirty? So I'm sorry, that's a very wordy way of saying I think it's a complicated issue, which is why I think tobacco is a very good example and very binary, because there is nothing good about it. So to actually get rid of tobacco, that can be clean, but there are not many products that are that binary.
You bring up some pretty fundamental questions, but I don't think we should beat ourselves up, because actually life expectancy and quality of life for many people over the last X number of years, I think, has improved. Now, I can see some are shaking their heads, and I know some have very different views of this. What we are seeing for the first time is possibly a generation who is going to be less healthy and have less life expectancy than the previous one. So I think now is a time when we really have to start acting and thinking. And we have to have governments taking some serious responsibility. So we've had, for example, in some countries, people trying to nudge people into better behaviours. And I read some article the other day that was saying, we've had enough of this nudging. Enough. We've got to now have a real push. We've got to start being serious around issues around health behaviours, around taxation, around access to unhealthy products. So I think we are now at a pivotal moment for whether or not we are going to take our responsibilities seriously and see us continue to progress, or whether we're not. But I do see there are some in the audience who obviously want to come in and are shaking their heads because they feel clearly that we have been on a downward trend for the last 100 years.
Thank you. My name is Kate Robertson. I'm a legal consultant at WHO. Actually, my background is in commercial health law, and I work with trade and investment lawyers and product specialists in tobacco. So we do quite a lot of the technical advice and capacity building at country level and regional office level and working with other partners. So as Nick has said, there's not enough of us to do all the work that needs doing, but certainly the capacity is there. My question was actually to Rachel. I was just wondering, when you're talking about tobacco being really binary, given the change in the tobacco market where you've got such a shift, including in some of the big tobacco companies who are moving away from the sort of more traditional products and into the electronic nicotine delivery system sort of market and that sort of space, and looking at novel products which they market very heavily as harm reduction as opposed to just the usual disastrous product that they in fact are. So just wondering, when you're actually talking to funds and investors about moving away from tobacco, does that include sort of E&Ds and the devices that deliver them as well, or is it just traditional products?
It includes those as well. And it's a question that always comes up because the investors in discussing with the tobacco companies are always under the impression that that is the solution, that is the future, and that is going to be where the majority of the revenue stream is going to come from. I guess the points that I try to point out is, A, that revenue stream is very small as a section of the total revenue stream at the moment. If the tobacco companies genuinely wanted that to be the solution, they would cease shipping traditional product. And the other point is, if they're saying it's reduced harm, then from an investor's perspective, they need to take into account that if the core product's killing 2 out of 3 users and the revised product only kills 1 out of 2, that's still an enormous amount of harm to be investing in. So it comes back to sort of starting at the ground and looking up rather than taking the view of, oh, we've made it a wee bit better, which is the traditional position currently for the tobacco companies. So yeah, it comes up every time.
So, yes, let's just hear from some more people. By the way, the Commission does not say capitalism is harmful to health, and I don't think you would have expected that. It says clearly that governments need to take more responsibility for the health of their people, which the WHO Constitution clearly says, and it says that companies need to be much more responsible actors than they are at present. And it tries to argue that in a variety of ways. So it's not, in a sense, and it never has been, if you follow through the history of the WHO, that it would say that one type of political or economic system is better or worse for health, because the organization has to work together with any kind of political or economic system to move the health agenda forward. That's the whole reason for multilateralism and for a UN organization, which is, a very delicate balance, because obviously we have countries of different political orientations that actually have quite good health progress, but on the other hand, are not the most democratic states, and not necessarily states that you or I might want to live in. And actually, one of the difficulties is that particularly tobacco control, of course, is an issue that is, if one looks at it with a political science point of view, is partly easier to introduce in a more totalitarian society than it is in a more democratic society where the industry interests are able, to push by or do whatever with politicians than somewhere else where the supreme leader takes a decision. So, those are very difficult tensions and very difficult issues also in the real life of a UN organization that you have to deal with. And I personally feel, they should be discussed much more because having a binary system here is not going to help people's health either. So I think those are very important and deeper discussions to be had, and I hope we have more of them. So just to say, we're not trying to shy away from the basic question that you've raised: in what kind of political system do we want to live? Obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals more or less say we want to move towards a society that's more equitable, that doesn't leave people behind, and that has healthier people and a healthier planet. Some people are starting to call that a well-being society. They're using models like the donut economy, etc., etc. So we'll have to see what kind of economic model develops in the 21st century, and what that economic model does mean for health. Finally, this debate, is it better, is it worse? I was actually very intrigued. I was in Stockholm recently, and I walked through the airport, and the whole airport is full of an orange book, and it's called Factfulness, and it's the work of Hans Rosling, who many of you know, and who actually, for everyone at this airport who is willing to buy this book, gives you the data that show that the health of the world has improved. And that doesn't mean it's good enough. That doesn't mean it's equal enough. That doesn't mean, a whole lot of things in relation to health insecurity and whatever. But I think it's also important for us as health advocates to indicate, where things have changed to the better, and where that progress that was made is now very, very, very seriously endangered. People that about 10 years ago, some excellent American epidemiologists raised for the very first time that, the next generation could live shorter lives and sicker lives than, for example, my generation. And they were laughed at. They were laughed at. And now we're at exactly that point in time. So over to you. And we'll collect a couple now and then come back.
Thank you. My name is Obi. I trained as a doctor in Nigeria, but currently work in health policy with the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. In 1998, when we developed the first global framework for control of NCDs, the WHO gave us data that NCDs contributed 43% of the global burden of disease and 60% of deaths. And the prediction was that by 2020, NCDs will cause 73% of deaths. WHO also told us that by 2015, NCDs already caused 70% of deaths. So in 20 years, the predictions that we had from 1998 to 2018, we're just going on that track, despite having launched global strategy for controlling NCDs. It seems like, looking at the data, not much has changed. I just want to ask, how much of a game changer do you actually think that looking at financing mechanisms and investments can actually be in controlling NCDs? Because the strategies we have been using for 20 years now haven't created as much impact as we would have loved.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. It's Cyril Pervilac. I'm at the Institute of Global Health at the University of Geneva and worked several years or many years at WHO and UNAIDS on HIV/AIDS. And my question is related to both of you panelists. Thank you for the presentation in relation to behavioral change. Going back on the words you mentioned, action on the ground and communication. So if we look, for example, the investments of taxes raised, for example, in France, and we put terrible pictures on these packs of tobacco packs in France. So and I see that you have a background, Rachel, in commercial media and interactive media programming. So what is the strategy that we should use for these aggressive marketing strategies that are so successful in the South, that are a little bit modern and adapted to the countries there? Do you have a tip or an advice to give us? And then to WHO, to my colleague from WHO, for example, on the outbreaks, there's a very nice strategy now at WHO for communication in outbreaks, but I don't see a similar communication strategy for NCDs or for tobaccos. I have worked many years in Africa on the expanded program on immunization with communication officers in the WHO offices, and I don't know how we're using those to tackle or come up with these media strategies in the countries? Thank you.
There are so many different questions. So my question is, there is any studies that they consider how to replace income to government by the taxation of the buds? Because, for example, here at 50 meters from you have the Japan tobacco, you know, if they are there,
I look at it every day from my desk, yes.
If they are there, it means there are some incentives provided by the Swiss government, and there are some advantages.
The canton, not the Swiss government.
Anyway, goes somewhere in the pocket. and second, also, you know, probably in the price of the cigarette packet, the tax may be 60% or so. This goes probably in the AVS or for the pension funds for the most lowest level of. So it's not an irrelevant contribution to government budget. And this is true here or in China, where, you know, of course, easy to in China to say you don't smoke here and there, but they also make calculations. And they probably see that the cost effectiveness is to maintain smoking in the buds in order to get the income taxes, and because it's cheaper than basically replacing with something else.
Nick, this leads into your investment case.
Well, let's just look at some of those questions and try and think them through, because the first one, in terms of the increased number of NCDs, yes. I don't think anyone is sufficiently naive to think that we aren't all going to die from something at some stage, and that's more likely to be a non-communicable disease than anything else. We clearly have got to try and reduce sickness and deaths at a young age, because that's not economically sound at all. But we also mustn't forget I call it a humanitarian imperative, for lack of a better term, that when people come to the end of their lives, they need to die in a dignified way. So we've got to make sure that there is palliative care and that there is pain relief for people at the end of their life. So we will continue to see increasing in non-communicable diseases, but we need to make sure that the right quality of care is available all the way through. Will financing resolve all this issue? It's like that old thing, isn't it? It's necessary but not sufficient. It doesn't matter how much financing you're going to throw at this. If people aren't going to make sound policy decisions, it's not going to make a difference. You can put as much money as you want into high-quality cancer control, but if you're not going to make sensible decisions about prevention, about investing in primary care, it's not going to make any difference. So we're only at the beginnings of now trying to work with countries, and countries starting to think about what are the policy implications here and how are they going to match up all the different myriad of tensions between ministries of finance and health and labour and trade and education and so on and so forth. So there's got to be a lot more thinking about this. And it therefore makes me think that when somebody makes the point about risk communication and you don't see enough of that out there, and we've had lots in communicable diseases but not enough, well, that's precisely where we need to see some greater investment and strategic endeavours, because we aren't seeing that. Yes, everyone can think of good examples where that's been done. But I remember being on the radio in Kenya once with someone from the Ministry of Health, and the journalist said to the person in the Ministry of Health, you talk about this being an emergency, you talk about this being important. When I go around to the rural areas of the provinces in Kenya, I've never seen anything about this. People don't know about this at all. So is financing going to solve this? No, but you can't actually take a national media campaign and do it systematically over a period of time if you don't have some financing.
Don't disagree with any of that, luckily. I want to add to the point that you raised about, where are we going? 20 years on, no clear change. I think that the point that we've managed to raise with the finance sector is that actually we need to work together, that no single entity or area is going to solve the problem, not just government, not just the health sector, and not just the finance sector, but SDG 17, which is all about partnerships, means that actually once they start to come together and start to have financiers saying, we're not going to fund this anymore, saying to their beneficiaries of their pension funds, by the way, there's nothing in tobacco because it's a product that we don't consider investing in anymore, that public health awareness of that decision is linked to the smoking cessation clinics and or the messaging around packs that have the health messages on them. It's about pulling it all together. I can't tell you how many entities say to me, I was in Sweden last week, and the fund I was talking to said, well, you're just going to have to get the government to ban cigarettes. And I said, this isn't something, it's not something the government can do. And they said, well, then they'll have to ban funding them. And I said, well, no government is able to say, unless it's not a democracy, you know, by the way, as an investor with your own independent pot of money, you can't choose what to put it into. That, you know, all of these things aren't going to happen. So what we really need to do is say, work together. Government has signed the FCTC. They agree with the impact of tobacco. They agree with the fact that we need to do something about it. The finance sector knows that from a business case perspective, it's a declining market. It's actually a bad business to be in. So even, you know, and even if you don't care about the health side, if you look at the numbers, this is a business that generally is not going to, we believe, do particularly well in the future. And then the third sector, you know, healthcare, we do need to keep working on this. We do need to keep working what we do, how we help people that are already suffering from NCDs, but we need to do it together. And I think that 20 years ago, possibly that wasn't happening. And I think that's the case because there are so many people I speak to who simply don't know the impact of the products. So that's the educational bit that then knocks onto the finance bit. And then the media comms, it sort of ties in. Communicating the problems and enabling people to take hold of those decisions. In Australia now, if you ask most people what their superannuation fund is invested in, is it in tobacco? They know. But that's because over a period of time, large funds have said, by the way, we're not in tobacco, and they've made a big deal about it. The packs are there. The taxation to the tax point is much higher. So all of those things together, government, health messaging, and the finance sector, they're coming together. And that's why my understanding is that their smoking rates of 13 to 15-year-old boys is 2%. That's the lowest in the world. And that's the combination. It's not just because of one single program.
And it's 30 years of policy.
Yeah.
Nick, I wanted to come back to the issue here because, you know, you write these investment cases. How do you describe, you know, the financial trade-offs, the tax here, the investment there, the dedicated tax, the, you know, if you tax tobacco or sugar now, over the long run, if consumption goes down, you know, what happens kind of thing. How do you address that?
Well, we first of all look to see what the cost and the impact is of non-communicable disease as a whole. And then we start looking at different interventions. And we look at ones which countries are particularly interested. So we don't look at all the so-called best buys and most cost-effective interventions. There isn't the capacity to be able to do that. One wants to paint a picture. And so we will discuss with countries exactly what the different interventions that they are interested in looking at. What plays to their political agenda at the moment? Yes, what's evidence-based policy as well? And then one starts looking at the return of investment on investment. So you will then say, for every dollar that you put into a salt reduction program, what will you get back? If you're going to work on tobacco taxation, you put $1 in to different interventions, what will you see in return? So then at the end, you just get a very simple graph or a table which will show you how much money over a 5-year period and a 15-year period you can take. Then the discussions to start. Okay, if you break even after 5 years, but you're going to have a huge impact after 15 years, then what's the approach that you're going to take? How are you going to make your decisions in investment? Which is why the economic investment case is done alongside, if you like, a political economy analysis, where you then have a look at that. And it might be nice to just bring in my colleague from UNDP Dudley, who's done some work in that area, to describe how that complements the nuts and bolts of the economic analysis. If you do an economic analysis on itself without thinking about the broader aspects, it's only going to go so far. So you've got to understand the political milieu, environment that you're working in before you embark upon this, and during and afterwards, so you can influence. So I don't want to take your position.
Yeah.
But
No, he has
I'm sorry.
the mic already.
I grabbed the mic because I wasn't sure Nick was going to, I thought he was just going to talk about financing and these things. But really, we started these investment cases a couple of years ago, and we've changed the methodology a lot since then, and changed the focus. And I think the first thing was to accept that, the numbers are not enough, and the economic arguments are not enough. It has to be grounded in a political reality. So we do a lot of emphasis on getting into the country, doing the interviews, making sure we know the political realities, who has what incentives to make which decisions, and trying to give people the political space to make the decisions they need to make. Because we start with the health burden, then we know the macroeconomic picture, we know the commercial incentives and the commercial determinants, and then beyond that, the way to solve it is through political action. So we try to get through that full stage in each country. And we've also started with long, boring reports that were, typical WHO stuff with 20 pages of epidemiological stuff, and then eventually there's a number. Sorry, it's true. Then we've said, okay, now, yeah,
style.
So now we've said, okay, maybe it's more about the presentation of it. It's getting in front of the finance minister, having time with them, and the PowerPoint may be more important than the actual investment case itself, the report. It may be that if we can make that visualization, especially for the non-health sector. So we have, in a lot of the countries now, we have a graphic that just starts with a circle that's, here's your revenue from alcohol, tobacco taxes. A little bit bigger circle, this is the capital outflows from your consumers spending their money that goes out to the people that invest in things that Rachel's trying to get them to disinvest from. Then you end up with the biggest circle, which is the economic burden. And that's not the health sector burden. The health sector burden is small. And so just visualizing this way, it helps us. But really, we don't need to apologize for looking at it from a political lens, because the solutions are political, and we have to create the space to let decision makers make the right solutions to it.
Okay, we have to round up soon. I'd like to ask one question. I don't know who wants to answer it, if Nick or you or whatever. I see a colleague here from Gavi, for example, and investment cases are all the rage. Everyone with every disease, every organization is now going into investment cases. And I don't know how similar or dissimilar they are. Probably they're reasonably similar because, you argue an investment. And so now everyone's discovered the finance minister. Sometimes they might take the health minister along or not, I don't know. The next person, of course, they've identified as the prime minister or the head of government. So I'm this finance minister, and you come in today and tell me with this wonderful PowerPoint-based investment case, tobacco's the thing. Kirsten comes in the next day and says, look, you've got to invest in vaccines. This is the trade-off. Then, the Global Fund comes along and says, you still have all this HIV/AIDS. Here's the investment case. So how are you guys going to resolve this?
Okay, so this is the angry phone call that I get from my friend and colleague, who I will quote, because I'm sure he would quote me, Michael Borovitz from the Global Fund, who's the chief economist of the Global Fund. And he gets angry with me, and I sometimes almost put the phone down on him. And what I would say to the Minister of Finance is first of all, we're not in competition. This isn't some big competition. And don't be worried, Global Fund and Gavi. You're still up there. But first of all, did you know this was an issue for you? And he may say, yeah, I did. Of course I did. Or he may say, actually, I didn't. After all, I did go to one Minister of Finance on one of our joint programming missions, and I sat down and he said, it's really nice to see you. Please come in. I don't know why you're coming to see me, but still, come in. And I said, well, I'll tell you why I'm coming to see you. And I took out a brochure which just says, Ministry of Finance, what NCDs mean for you. And this wasn't about, we need more money from you. It was, do you realize what its impact is? We went through the different things, and at the end they said, and you can do this, this, and this. And at the end he said, that's really helpful to know. Now I understand why you came to see me. I didn't know why before, but I do. I'll take this brochure away and I will read it and think about it. But I would say that actually most health systems are investing in healthcare and they are investing in NCDs, are you spending your money most effectively? So actually, yes, this is for Ministries of Finance, but it's also for the Ministry of Health. One of the comments that so many ministers of finance say to us is, we give these ministers of health all this money, we don't get much in the way of return in terms of knowledge or information on what's going on out there. And they all have these multi-sectoral action plans now. So, Minister of Finance, do you want to be giving all your money to the Ministry of Health, or actually, do you want to be going and giving some money to the Information and Communications Group Ministry, because they may be able to spend that money? So it's not all about more money, it's about using that money more efficiently. I went to another country and I remember we did have this conversation where the Ministry of Health was sitting around there saying, we've got this beautiful multi-sectoral action plan and all these ministers know all about it and ministries know all about it and they're all here and we've coordinated this response. And they said, well, we did know you'd been developing something, and we have never really been engaged in the process, but we do see it's a whole of government thing, but not really. And then one ministry, it was the Information of Communication, if you gave us a tiny, tiny smidgen of your money, we could do a much better job than you are getting the message out. So it's not about, don't worry, Mr. Global Fund or Mr. Gavi, don't worry, we're not in competition. We're about trying to make sure that what resources that you have are used effectively. And if you are thinking about investing new partners, development partners in the new SDG environment, then actually these are the areas that you could invest in because they will make a big difference.
Well, actually, as far as I've seen some of the other discussions and investment cases, these Gavi and Global Fund people really love you because they're telling the ministers they should tax tobacco, sugar, and whatever else, but with a dedicated tax in order to finance vaccinations, AIDS programs, and universal health coverage. So in an interesting way, the NCD agenda and a lot of other disease agendas are actually coming together. And I think that is quite intriguing, actually, at a time also of the Sustainable Development Goals, and could be an interesting strategic cooperation between the programs because you're actually giving similar messages. Obviously, not all countries can do dedicated taxes, and there's lots of provisos. But I was really intrigued to talk to and listen to some of the colleagues, and even Larry Summers, etc. Are big macroeconomists who are all into stacks, as we call them now, sugar, alcohol and tobacco tax, or health promotion levies, or however you want to call them, and who suddenly see that this could be a source of finance that could benefit everyone, including building a health system. So that might be our next conversation. We're in Switzerland, we need to be punctual. So I would like to ask each of you to say, when we come here to have this discussion, whether it's a new economic paradigm or not, but to have this type of discussion again, which we are doing every year. Last year we discussed the commercial determinants, now we're doing this. What would you like to discuss, and where would you like us to be? Rachel, you start. Ladies first.
What would I like us to discuss? I'd like us to discuss how we've managed to change the language that we use to talk to the finance sector to one that everybody is familiar with, so that the message is very clear. And where would I like us to be? I would like us to be moving very strongly towards tobacco-free investment being the default option, that anybody investing in tobacco is doing so because they have actively chosen to do it, not because it's happened to them.
Thank you, Nick.
I would very much like us to now move the conversation on NCDs to the old-fashioned development speak around voice and accountability. Are we getting consumers and people at the grassroots demanding change, demanding their politicians take action, and are we holding them to account for what works? And is the media doing a good job in doing that? And I know in some countries the media is a very effective and powerful check on what's happening, and holding the private sector to account, holding government to account. But increasingly, I think that the the public in many countries are demanding action, and government and the private sector are dragging their feet, and I think people are going to get increasingly frustrated. So I would like to be moving towards the old-fashioned thing of voice and accountability.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank this great group. Thank you very much. Thanks, Emily.